plan, one of those being municipal dollars, one of those being transportation federal dollars. Those are instruments for executing that vision. So we're going to focus on the comprehensive plan elements in particular, because that's really where the 2040 resides. And this is a graphic taken from the 2040 that sort of helps lay out what it is that we do with plans and why we have them. The comprehensive plan, Anchorage 2020, is our broad land use policy. And then supplementing that is the work that went into the 2040 plan. Both of those lead to the actual zoning map that all of us rely on in the work that we do every day. It's the action to carry out those visions. Yes. Interrupt anytime, by the way.
Thank you. Would you mind speaking a little slower? Because I feel like I just want to absorb, and I'm having a hard time. So
sure.
The first two, the land use policy map, or Anchorage 2020 and Anchorage 2040 land use plan, make up what we call the comprehensive plan. So when we say this is consistent with the comprehensive plan, it's those two?
Yeah, correct. That's a good nomenclature thing I should clear up. That typically when you talk about something conforming to the comprehensive plan, it can be referenced in either. We're typically referring to just 2020 because we do like to single out that 2040. While it is an element of the 2020 plan, it actually carries out some specific ideas, visions, et cetera, that aren't in 2020. So sometimes in your case packets you will see specific reference to 2040 over 2020, but broadly speaking, they're sort of lumped together. Yeah.
And actually, I just want to state for the record that we've been joined by Mr. Weddleton and Mr. Perez-Rudia. And actually, Mr. Weddleton has a question.
It's not a question of a statement, because actually it is, I think, more complicated than that, because our comprehensive plan includes, it's like that's the core document, but the Hillside District Plan, the Midtown Plan, there's dozens of plans. And
right.
When we adopt them as a component to the comprehensive plan. And the more recent can override the older. So there's things in the Hillside District Plan that aren't totally conforming with the 2020. Those are the ones that are the Hillside District Plan.
Interesting. Okay.
Our Hillside District Plan has a trails map, which overrides the Hillside Area Trails map. And the trails plan, which is part of it. So
because they're updated more frequently, theoretically.
it's more recent. So
Yeah.
it does get caught. If you go to the trails plan and say this is our plan, well, not so.
And that hierarchy is important, and let's see if this laser pointer works. I know it's hard to read, but that hierarchy is demonstrated in this graphic here, which does come from the 2040 plan, and that's well stated, Assemblymember Weddleton, that there are elements of all of those other plans that are very specific to those areas or those neighborhoods, but sometimes there will be overriding elements of the comprehensive plan, or more specifically of the 2040 land use plan, which, as the most recently adopted element of the 2020 plan, supersedes it. But those are not common. They were relatively infrequent, and anywhere that the 2040 plan was set to deviate from either the existing 2020 or perhaps some of the findings of the individual neighborhood plans, those were all evaluated during the drafting process and evaluated by planning and zoning before saying, yes, we'll go with this one over this one. So there was some thoughts put into it, but you're absolutely right. It can be sometimes a little hierarchical and tough to follow.
Mr. Perez-Rudia, did you have a question?
Sure, yeah. So I just to do another clarifying question. These exceptions to the plan are primarily in the 2040 land use. So what Mr. Weddleton is talking about is the exceptions within that, or is that
No,
true?
and I should have prepared a specific example to show you this, but one example, a hypothetical example, would be in a neighborhood plan, where a neighborhood plan, when it was drafted, thought on the corner of this street is really where we want to concentrate all of our retail services, and it should be all zoned retail, and this is what we want. Development patterns changed, and now after we've worked through the 2040 land use plan, it's clear that maybe that is not the case anymore for whatever reason. The street, is closed or something. And there will be elements that the 2040 plan said, in this area, even though the neighborhood plan thought it should be commercial, we think it should be retail. These are the reasons why we thought that. And the 2040 plan will supersede that neighborhood plan because of that in that one element. But again, these are very rare instances. There aren't There are, as far as I can remember, there are no instances where we have said a historic use is no longer that use, and we want it all to be something different. But all of those plans do feed into both of these, and they are important elements at the micro levels, how I typically describe them for those neighborhoods, while this is much more macro for the whole.
Thank you. Sure. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. So how many district plans are there? Like, does every community have one? And who drives that process? And how do we avoid NIMBYism if they can trump aspects of the more broad comprehensive plan?
Well, they can't. So let me back up and answer your questions in order. There are district-specific plans that are not technically neighborhood plans. An example of that would be the downtown Anchorage comprehensive plan, which is more than a neighborhood plan. But then there are neighborhood plans like the really well-written Mountain View neighborhood plan, which was, I think, our last adopted neighborhood plan. Right before that was the UMed district plan. So there are district plans and neighborhood plans that all feed into it for just about all of Anchorage, I think, except for a few areas that are still interested in doing either their own neighborhood plan or, in some cases, a new sub-plan of their neighborhood plan. So that's the first part of the question. And then as far as who controls those, largely those are driven by both the community of interest and the planning department. In the case of the Mountain View plan, for example, you had a very active nonprofit that helped with that, to facilitate that as well. That was ACLT. In the example of the Fairview neighborhood plan, you had a very robust and rambunctious community council that led a lot of that, and they were really drivers of that. So it just depends on the area, but there is municipal involvement or staff involvement, but they are really community driven. And to your last question, I don't know the answer to that, but because these come from the community, they represent the views of those communities, and whatever those views may be, that somehow manifest themselves in the plans, yes. Neighborhood plan can't outright change zoning, can't outright contradict or conflict with the comprehensive plan. They're designed to be execution at a micro level of the vision for that area.
And maybe additive, like they
Correct.
might have a trails plan that isn't, okay.
Yeah, additive is a great word.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Crystal, then Fred.
Okay, thank you. Kind of along the line with Austin's question about district plans and neighborhood plans. In the Chugach Eagle River Comprehensive Plan, we have references to district and business plans, but there's only a couple of district plans I can think of. I don't know of any neighborhood plans. So does Chugach Eagle River have any neighborhood plans?
So you're in a unique boat in that the Chugach Eagle River Comprehensive Plan is a large, we call it a district plan, but it's a large scale neighborhoods plan for the community. And within that community, outside of the CBD, there have not been, as far as we know, there's not been interest in organizing neighborhood plans at that level. It probably could be done if it was needed, but we haven't seen that yet. Now, the Chugach River Comprehensive Plan itself is about, let's see, 2007, 2008. Yeah, so it's getting up there, and it'll go through an update process at some point in the next several years as well. There's a number of those plans that need to be updated like that.
But the only district plan that was actually our business district plan.
Right, with the
Okay.
CBD.
All right. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead, Fred.
Now, when it's appropriate in your discussion, I'd like you to comment a little bit about grandfathering, and particularly commercial properties.
Sure.
And so on. And secondly, the overall issue is policy issue. When somebody buys a piece of property and so on, how long could they reasonably expect the zoning that was true when they bought will stay in place?
Actually, I can answer both of those mostly. So this is the, so we go from broad policies in our comprehensive plan to both improvements on those policies as well as an updated land use plan in the 2040 plan, and then it results in this zoning map. And the zoning map is bowl wide. It shows the current zoning. A lot of that zoning, some of that zoning, not a lot, but is actually out of date. And so to the idea, to the question that you asked about grandfathering, if you own a piece of land and have owned it for 30 years and it still has some out of date or antiquated zoning district, that stays with it until such time as that property sells or needs to be brought forward for development and needs to be updated. But
Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah.
So, Crystal and I have places north of here where somebody's had dog racers, and they've had dog kennels there, or they have horses run the carriages and stuff downtown, or they've had a auto repair shop or something. So, new people that move in a subdivision around there get all their knickers in a knot because they're hearing dogs howl or smelling horse manure, or don't like a repair shop doing what they do. So then they put pressure on to get those people out. But the downside also for that grandfather rights is those people developed that piece of land for their thing, thinking that they could pass it on to their children or sell it for their retirement or whatever. And those uses that were there that made it attractive to some buyers go away. It seems to me that there's some unfairness there.
They can, Fred. And that's not a universal statement. So there's two distinct concepts, which I actually don't have in the slideshow, but I'll do my best to explain. And that is the concept of the underlying zoning of the land,
Yep.
and then related to that, the allowable uses of that zoning. And so in the instances that you're describing of a historic use that neighbors don't like, that historic use is an established use.
Yes.
So they have grandfather rights, as you call it, non-conforming rights to stay there and operate. They can continue to operate beyond that by establishing those non-conforming rights. And what that means is, in essence, is to use Fred's example, is if you had a historic dog kennel and you've been there for 30 years and you do want to do something to it, you can establish non-conforming rights through the municipality. There is a process by which you can establish, this has been what it's been for so long, and it will remain this way, so that new requirements and provisions may not need to apply to that property because of the historic use.
But is that historic use transferable to the family, or if they want to sell it?
So once you've established non-conforming rights, that property stays frozen in time is one way to look at it. And so the short answer to your question would be yes. If it was transferred between family members, absolutely. What happens though is if they move forward to what's that?
Or between anyone.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to
sorry.
be a family
I'm just
member.
using
Yeah.
his hypothetical. Non-conforming rights will extinguish at some point if they try to improve the property.
Expand the business.
I don't know. Again,
Yeah,
I don't know the
those are-
specifics of your case, but,
Yeah, but-
within reason, I think there is some flexibility with expanding the business. But what we're really talking about is any expansion of the use. So they can't bring the site more out of conformity by expanding the use, whatever that means. But they can expand. They can do
More
more
intense.
dogs, I guess.
More intense in what's there. Yeah, so that's troublesome. You can argue that both ways. And certainly, the nature of the whole city has changed in my lifetime.
Sure.
And so on. So, what does a pioneer who was there ahead of time? What responsibility do they have to cave into what the neighborhood has done? And so on. And at what point does the force of law come and say, you can't exercise all the rights you had when you bought this piece of property. We're going to restrict them, which could be arguably as a taking by government.
I
And
would
I'm
argue
sure people in your kind of business nationwide have dealt with these for generations.
Yeah, and that's why the establishment of non-conforming rights for historic uses like that exists, because of the grandfather rights that you mentioned. And once those are established, you ask what's the legal hammer? That's the legal
Sure.
protection,
Sure.
if you will, for that property owner. But
But they're limited.
But they are limited. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's rational.
Yeah.
All right. And thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, but the question of how long should somebody buys a piece of property, new homeowner, expect the zoning to stay in place?
So zoning doesn't change arbitrarily.
Right.
Right. So for zoning to change, either that person would have to rezone their property, or if they're concerned about people around them, the zoning changing around them, that also does not happen until a private property owner would come in and rezone that property. So in your instance, Fred, if a homeowner bought a house and it's near this dog kennel,
Take that out. Let's say it's an R2 lot somewhere.
yeah, if you buy an R2 lot, it is an R2 lot and stays that way until such time as you choose to rezone it. Now, what can happen, and this is what I referenced earlier, is some zonings just go away. And so there are a number of parcels throughout the municipality that have what we consider an antiquated zoning. It's still in place, it still stands, and it still has, whatever uses were allowable under that code still stand with it. But technically speaking, they're old versions of a zoning district that don't exist anywhere else, and slowly, over time, they are being rezoned by private property owners and being brought up to modern standards.
Yeah, so we have these isolated, somebody built a home, no neighbors for a quarter or a half mile away, and very reasonably, that in the planning process, that was chosen to be commercial, light industrial. Very good use of that land, and here's this poor guy that bought a house that's been there for 45 years, surrounded by bus barns and auto repair shops.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that is the changing nature of the community too.
Yeah, and that purchaser should have known there was a risk of that.
One thing I won't get us too far off topic, but one thing that I've noticed recently is that the real estate community is beginning to pay a lot more attention to zoning and zoning concepts. And in fact, a number of realtors, or companies at least, have asked their realtors to disclose that things like zoning can change. Yeah.
Yep.
So that buyers are aware.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Which is important to know. So back on track, these are just, again, this is the flow of the documents. You have the 2020 plan that flows to the 2040 plan, which in turn both flow into Title 21. And that's how we implement the comprehensive plan. So moving specifically to the 2040 land use plan, this was an exciting project. It was literally one of the first projects that I got to participate in when we started here, and it was begun in July roughly of 2015. And what is the plan? The plan is, as I've already covered, supplements 2020. It provides an updated land use plan map that shows where future land uses are likely to occur. It's designed to anticipate the growth that we'll see over the next 25 years, and I'll get into all this in much more detail. But also something that's unique, I think more unique to this plan, is that it really emphasizes the action portion of planning, and that is, if we're going to set these goals for our community based on projected growth, and we say to mitigate concerns about these goals, we need to do these actions. Typically, there's not a lot of follow-through and not a lot of thought put into how those become real. And this is a plan that is designed from the ground up to have tangible outcomes that are measurable. And so we'll cover all that in a bit, but I wanted to highlight that. So it was a very lengthy process over the nearly 2 years that we spent, or over 2 years spent putting this together. There were a lot of stakeholder groups that were involved from both the public and the private sector, a lot of neighborhoods and communities, as well as industries, et cetera. The plan itself is laid out in 3 broad sections. Section 1 is sort of I call it the narrative section. This is the real vision section of the plan. It makes the argument for why this plan is needed. It talks about the forecasted growth of our community over the next 25 years. And it talks about sort of the foundational strategies that the plan is adopting to address that growth over that time period. Section 2 is predominantly the land use plan map itself, and we'll pull up the electronic version of this. All of the work that we did on the 2040 land use plan coincided with the expansion of our GIS capacities, and so a lot of the documents in here have a map counterpart available on the GIS, the Planning Department's GIS webpage. In fact, we have a map gallery that's dedicated to the 2040 land use plan itself. So things like the land use plan, things like an overview of where community plans are, neighborhood plans are, and how they all lay in bold. You can find all that online. It's really helpful. And then lastly, section 3, this is the part I just talked about. This is a pretty thorough and comprehensive action catalog, if you will, of strategies and policies to carry out the plan. Jumping into the vision of the plan, this was developed through a lot of interaction with stakeholder groups, with the community. What are the issues that you see coming in the next 25 years, and what do you want your community to be? This is a very poorly put together wordle of a lot of the topics that came out of that we have actually incorporated into the plan, and we call these out as key visions of this plan, from the recognizing our place in the natural open space and wildlife, to compact development that recognizes the need for this community to get more dense, and much to my pleasure, a focus on a healthy economy. That this isn't just about housing, this isn't just about parks or open space, this is about a healthy, vibrant economy too. So those were all vision components of the plan. In that first section, as we lay out the argument for why this plan update is needed, we talk about the forecast that we're seeing for the next 25 years. And all of the forecasting information is available in the appendices of the plan itself, which again is also online. So if you really want to delve into fascinating things like the traded sector lands analysis, those are available for you to pore over. But the takeaway is that we are using sort of a healthy but moderate growth scenario for the plan. So over the next 25 years, we don't expect a large boom, and we don't expect a large exodus. We think it'll be slow and steady. Population growth rate, for example, that we picked is 0.8%. Which is a pretty good, I think, middle ground between the high and low scenarios that other economists have predicted. And the employment growth rate is about 0.9%. Keep in mind, this is an average growth rate between 2015 and when the plan was started, and 2040 when we think is our target date. Given even that sort of moderate growth scenario, there's a number of things that came straight to the forefront. First and foremost in that was that there's a housing supply gap. And this is something we've known about for a while. Many of you are familiar with the 2012 study that we did with the McDowell Group that looked at housing supply in Anchorage and recognized that there was a need to build about 900 units a year to keep up with our projected population growth over the next 25 years. This plan largely sustains that. Although we've scaled back a little bit because they had a higher population growth scenario than we did. But the gap still exists. And then related to that, there's still a commercial and industrial land supply gap. Industrial is the one that I like to pay extra close attention to. The fancy word that I used earlier, traded sector, that's largely industrial uses. Those are high volume, high dollar jobs and industries. And industrial land is very complex and complicated to deal with in a planning scenario as it relates to its place in the community. You went through that recently with a rezone near a residential neighborhood that had industrial uses. But these industrial lands, on average, generate more revenue for cities and for people than any other land use that exists. So it's a very valuable and important land use for a community, and it's one that we're paying very close attention to.
I have a question from Austin.
Thank you, Felix. Chris, I was just wondering, well, first I was sort of thinking about our current economic climate and whether this is accurate, but I think we have 20 years to hopefully right the ship and get things together. But you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then I'm wondering, I've talked with Nancy Burke just about homelessness, and she sort of consistently will use this stat that, we have an 8% housing surplus, or I don't know what the right term is, and so there's plenty of room for people to live. It's just about getting them there. Do you know how that squares with what you're saying, and is it a different type of housing? Maybe it's for people who are experiencing homelessness, and that's a different unit sort of thing they're looking for, or what's out there and what do we need?
So I'm not entirely familiar with what Nancy is referring to, although I think it sounds, if you're using the number 9%, I think she's probably referring to the vacancy rate. Yeah, the vacancy factor in Anchorage fluctuates between about 5, which is actually unhealthy. you should have a vacancy rate of about 6 to 10%
Oh,
in a
okay.
community. Yeah.
Okay.
If you have a small vacancy rate, for a while we went through a 3% vacancy rate. That's terrible.
Yeah.
That means rents go through the roof.
And is that like cities like San Francisco or Seattle? Do they have really low rates like that? Okay.
Yeah. So a vacancy rate of 9% just means that there's apartments available out there. What this focuses on is residential units based on population growth. And so when we say that there's, even with the land that we have in the bowl that can be developed, there's still a gap of 7,900 units that we need to make up somehow. And what I'm saying in that, what we're saying with that is just that the buildable land, the available land supply, doesn't support the projected residential unit growth that we would need in our community. So it's not a matter of a vacancy factor. It's just we can't build under the current scenarios and the current zonings and the current land use patterns. We can't build enough housing for people that we project will be here in 25 years.
So that's going to be a shortage of 7,900 in 2040 or
Yes.
now? Okay.
Yeah, no, sorry, that's in 2040.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then related to that, on the industrial side, we focus on acres, not units, obviously, but we have a very large shortfall there too.
Can I ask one follow-up?
Sure.
Which is, as currently zoned, that meant in the 2020 comprehensive plan,
Yeah.
that's the reason for doing
Yeah,
this.
and we'll get into that in a few slides here. But really, the goal of the forecast section in the 2040 land use plan map is to illustrate that we have, if we assume a steady but moderate growth scenario over 25 years, we have a potential problem where we'll have more people than available land to build, unless we figure out how to activate these levers. And those levers are in the action section that we'll get to later.
Perfect, thank you.
And I have a question from Meg.
So for the plan with the forecasting in particular, I've heard it used to justify the need for other large infrastructure projects such as roads. How does the plan interface with like road projects, particularly where road projects could actually take out residential units and the like? What's the interface there? Because I know that's federal and state dollars often with a very little municipal interaction. So
And Assemblymember Weddleton and I both serve on AMATs, and one of the things that I'll offer is that, and Assemblymember Peterson, thank you. I'll offer is that we, over the past couple of years, we have seen DOT in particular begin to recognize the importance of land use in making some of their decisions when it comes to transportation. It hasn't gone far enough, in my own opinion. I don't know how the other two members feel, but I'd like to see it go further. But it's being recognized now as an important component of transportation, and that transportation, there's no need for transportation without land use. So if you take care of one but not the other, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, John.
I will add and try to restrain myself. Because we have an issue in my district close to yours where DOT is building an underpass on the highway, which is a good thing. And they're taking out tremendously valuable land uses. And they don't value that in the cost. It's just, what did we pay for that land? It's totally wrong. But we are working very actively on scoring. How do you score projects? And it's been skewed towards bigger, faster, better, greater. Just get out of our way. But I think within the end of the year, scoring our projects will be much more skewed to our plan and implementing our plan. It's very important.
So if I can ask a follow-up question, so that's our ability to interface our plan with that is through things like AMAT scoring.
Yeah, so in one of the earlier slides, I talked about the vision of the plan and the recommendations of the plan, whether it's a comprehensive plan or the 2040 plan. Those become executed through tools like the CIP and, in our case, the TIP.
Okay.
So I share Mr. Weddleton's frustration and interest in seeing more recognition of the land use and recognizing that more lanes doesn't always mean better throughput, but the two do go hand in hand.
Thank you.
It's an important connection to maintain too. I just would add. I know that that's been something that transportation planning has begun to recognize more over the past couple of years. I would hate to see it go away.
It's definitely a constituent frustration, particularly at the community council level, where the consultant comes in, explains the new highway project, and it's contrary to the neighborhood plan or the district plan or the land use plan goals. And I wasn't sure how it all.
Yep. So getting back on track, we talked a little bit about, we're predicting this shortage in residential units and in buildable industrial lands. How do we go about doing that? This is a fuzzy graphic, but you can see it much more clearly in your plan itself. It talks about if we actually activate some of the levers and tools that we're proposing in the 2040 land use plan, we'll be able to shrink that gap. And it's no surprise here, we're talking about things like more dense, more compact housing, more flexibility in zoning codes to allow more housing in more areas, i.e. commercial areas. And then on the commercial front, on the business side, we're talking about more efficient use of the land that they have for them. There's only so much you can do with warehouse space, for example, but for office space and others, you can certainly be more dense. And I like to point out the King Street Brewery, whether they plan this or not, they are demonstrative of what a more efficient footprint can look like for what is an industrial function and a retail function. So thinking like that as we move forward, I think will help with the lack of supply. The plan is laid out pretty generically from a strategic planning point of view in that we have high-level goals of the plan. The goals then influence the policies that we're going to recommend. Those policies then funnel into one of these sort of strategy tunnels or tubes, if you will, and what spills out of that is actual individual action items, or Skittles as they like to call them. It's laid out pretty well for a planning document as far as trying to organize all of those thoughts from grand vision all the way down to nuts and bolts nitty-gritty. And we're going to actually go through each of those layers of organization at a very high level in the next few slides. So starting very broadly with goals, the goals are broad statements of importance for the community. Just to single out how the diagram above works, I wanted to highlight one goal that's near and dear to my heart, which is accessible land use. As a broad goal for the community, we then said, what are the policies that we think help us achieve that vision or that goal? And these are the broad policies that the plan recommends for achieving those. Spilling out further and in later slides from these will be the actual strategies and actions that realize these policies. But one way to think about it is to go from the sort of the narrative to the more focused areas of interest for each narrative, and then specific actions to achieve those areas. This is the land use plan map. Sorry, we're moving on to section 3 here, which is the actual land use plan map. This is unique in that the land use plan map looks at Anchorage and it looks at it broadly. It breaks it up into sort of 18 easily identifiable chunks, or land use designations, which is the typical term they use. And that's just to give a sense of how the community has developed historically and where we see it going over the next 25 years. As you can see from looking at the land use plan map from 30,000 feet, we have a high concentration of activity in our corridors in northeast Anchorage there, and large swaths of residential development in our southern portions, and then of course the airport and the green space on either side. The land use designations themselves are broken down into specific areas, which again, I apologize, it's hard to read. So for example, neighborhoods, which is a type of place. Under neighborhood, we identify on the map more specific, large lot, single family duplex, multifamily, urban residential. We break that down into more distinct sort of generic zonings or generic locations. All of this is visible on the online GIS map, zoomable. It's a much easier tool to use than a fuzzy graphic on a screen.
I have one too, I can pass it around.
Sure. Yeah, you can have a printed one. The GIS one is so much more fun because you can just zoom in at any level that you really want. So the way that land use designation works is we identify a type of place generically. We say what's the land use designation, and then under each land use designation in the document, each land use designation has a list of its uses, its character, its density, its zoning, its location. And since we don't have copies here, this is an example page. This is the single family and two family and it identifies what the uses are, what the character of our single-family and two-family neighborhoods are, what the density typically is, and what the zoning typically is. And so this does not do anything to the zoning itself. It just recognizes that these are the typical zonings in which we will have these uses. In addition to the plan has several growth supporting features. This is a new addition to comprehensive plan thinking. Comprehensive plans usually are just, here's where you put your houses, and here's where you put your businesses, and here's where you put your parks. What this plan recognizes is that there's a lot of ways to fill those gaps between and create new neighborhoods or new environments, and those are the growth supporting features. These are the kinds of things that help spur economic and community development in those areas. Things like transit-supported development or transit-oriented development. Those are new concepts that we didn't have in our existing comprehensive plan that are brought into this plan that recognize the importance of a robust transit system and what that means from an economic and community development standpoint. We have greenway-supported development, which it shouldn't be a shock to anybody, but having a lot of greenways throughout our city makes it really exciting for investment, and it can spur development and redevelopment in and around those greenways. Traditional neighborhood design, this is just a recognition that the neighborhood design of yesterday is coming back into vogue, that the neighborhoods like Rogers Park and South Addition and others that follow a fairly static grid system with a smaller lot size, smaller footprint, and reliable transportation network with non-motorized transportation facilities as well, is really sort of the neighborhood design that grants you the greatest density available for single-family neighborhoods and gets us away from sprawling subdivisions that have long circuitous roads and not as many houses. Not that there's anything wrong with those, I've lived in those too, but when you talk about a dwindling land supply, a traditional neighborhood grid is actually a much more efficient way to use your land. And then lastly, mixed-use development, which is not necessarily a new concept to us or to Anchorage, but the plan recognizes that this is a real growth-supporting feature that will help not only meet housing needs, but can also help with our economic and community development needs as well. So strategies and actions, moving into the fun part of the plan. This is section 3 of the plan. Strategies and actions includes a lot of tools that you probably are familiar with and have seen during your time on the Assembly. Tools like zoning and development regulation changes. We've put a couple of those in front of you. Capital improvements, we're doing those fairly regularly. Financing and taxation, you saw the downtown housing tax incentive, you'll see more soon. Land acquisition and prep. In our 3 years here, we've acquired several pieces of land and are turning them over to development. Elizabeth Place, just down the street, being a real-world example you can see today. And then coordination and partnerships. And this is one where we recognize that the city can't be a city alone. We have to have good coordination, good partnerships with both of our public sector organizations and our private sector organizations to help move this plan forward. The Anchorage Chamber of all organizations has been a huge proponent of the 2040 Land Use Plan, and they were very actively involved in this. And it kind of surprised me. I'm not speaking ill of the Chamber, I'm a Chamber member, but it wasn't the kind of thing I thought that they'd really rally behind, and I was really impressed to see over those 2 years how much they got involved in it. So that's part of the partnership that we think will make this successful. So just to reorient us, we go from our goals and policies into distinct strategies. The strategies are lanes, if you will. That's how I think of them, for funneling those policies into actual actions. I'm not going to go through all of them. This is all in your document, but we use those to funnel them, and then we bring it all together. We bring it all together by creating what we call the action checklist. And this is in the sort of the back third of your document. The action checklist very clearly lays out what those goals are and what the actions are and how we're going to achieve them. And this is just one snapshot of one. So we have the high-level goal here, and then what the actions are to achieve that goal. They're all assigned a unique identifier, so they can be tracked. Some are identified as needing funding. They all have responsible parties, and they all recognize a time frame. And then in some cases, there's a need to say it also relates to other plan studies or things that are happening.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Fred.
forgive me for being slow. Back at almost the first stages of the planning process, was there a category in there for considering where we put public offices and facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the
So it's been historic here that we have said all of government functions will be downtown.
correct.
We may be in the process of repenting of the thoroughness of that, but what was the land use process that located Brother Francis Shelter and the Sleep-Off Center and all that, so those facilities right next to downtown?
I don't know the history of those. I wasn't here when they were decided, but I assume that it's because they met the zoning use and they built them.
Yeah, and even we can learn, I think. Do you think we have enough protection in our process that those things will get thorough consideration in the future?
I think so, yeah.
The answer's got to be yes. That was rhetorical.
Yeah, and I think that the 2040 land use plan doesn't dive into the specifics of homeless or transient shelters, but recognizes that things like social services have to be cognizant of their place in the neighborhood. As far as protections, though, I think it's not a function of this plan. That's more of a function of zoning code, and that's a topic that I know that many people are interested in right now and working on.
Yeah, and I don't want government directing people what to do and so on, but those kind of things, that is hugely restricted, commercial development on some very desirable land. And if I was in a neighborhood looking for a place to locate my business, I wouldn't want to be right next to a Payday Cash, tattoo shop, head shop, and massage parlor, which kind of characterize a neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Commenting on other questions.
Yeah, that's fine. So moving on, the one of the pages in your land use plan map that I find most useful is what we call the strategies and actions, or as I like to call it, the Skittles and actions, because if you actually look at it, they look like yummy little Skittles. This is unique for planning documents, at least for Anchorage, in that it very clearly says, here's a number of things we think we'll do, and we'll do them by this date, and these are the people that are responsible. The flavor, I guess, is who's responsible. All of the numbers inside of these Skittles correspond to action items in the full strategies and actions section, the actions checklist. So you have a way to look specifically at what that action was, who were the responsible parties, and what was the time frame. The Skittles chart is designed to be updated regularly so that we can show where progress has been made, we can show where more needs to be done. But it's broken down into sort of broad types of actions, and then when they're going to occur. We started out by trying to put them in order, sort of which one was a priority, bless you, for a given year, and which one was later in the year, but that proved to be challenging, so they're just generically grouped now in year targets. But for example, this one right here, Economic Development Tools 2-1, if I recall, was the downtown housing incentive. 2-5 was. And we got to that in 2018, like we thought we would, and we'll keep moving that forward. So this is a handy chart. It's one of the last pages of your document. It's a handy chart to refer to just identify quickly and easily when and where things are supposed to be happening. Again, this is a living, breathing document, so it will be regularly revisited and updated. And we look forward to providing updates to the Assembly on some of the progress that we've made regularly as well. In fact, I think at the CEDC, we're scheduling regular updates to this.
Like annually, biannually?
I think annually is probably the most effective, yeah. Anyway, that's it largely. We're about an hour into it, and that's it largely for 2040, unless people have specific questions or follow-up. think the only other thing, if I may, Mr. Chair, is I'd like to show folks the GIS page.
Sure.
Get it to show on that screen. There we go. Okay, this is really squished, so it looks weird, but on the Muni GIS webpage, you have a button that takes you to your Maps and Apps galleries. We have a gallery dedicated to planning. And within that planning gallery, there is one specific to the 2040 land use plan. And as it loads, you can see there's a number of maps available for you to click through. It's all easy to follow. If you wanted to see where the area-specific plans exist, for example, you could do that, areas of growth and change, housing stock, etc. The actions map, since this is one we were just talking about, we could look at that. So if you're wanting to find out where particular actions identified in the plan are supposed to be happening, here's the legend on the side. Small area plans, for example, or special study areas, you can see those. We identify one here in the C Street, Minnesota curve. As that area begins to develop out, it's certainly ripe for a special area plan. The RFAs, which several of you have been following, and where those are identified for being located, etc. So these are handy maps. I recommend you spend an hour or so on the GIS webpage. You'll be blown away at all the things you can do. And all of these come from the 2040 land use plan. So I hope those are useful. Anyway, that's it on 2040, unless people have other questions, and I'll move into the rezoning portion.
All right. Great. Don't see any
Really
questions.
helpful.
Thank you.
Just let me comment.
Sure.
Of all the things I see that the city has been doing over a long period of time, the planning function is exemplary of people, a very good process, and darn good people working it.
Thank you.
Does that include Chris, or not really technically, since he's...
Thank you for that, Fred. I couldn't agree more. I have worked with the city for over a decade and been at the city for the past 5 years, and I can't tell you how impressed I am with the people that are here and the depth of knowledge that exists here.
And the process.
And the process. Yes. Yep. So let's switch gears and let's talk actual nuts and bolts and dive into some rezoning questions. And I wasn't really clear what questions you may have going into this, so if I'm veering off topic, let me know, or if you have questions, please ask them as we go. But just to reorient folks, where we're going to be talking today in Chapter 2103, Title 21 as we know it. Chapter 3 and Title 21 deals with all the review and approval procedures, not just for boards and commissions, but also for any sort of administrative procedure, etc. One thing that all of them have in common in Chapter 3 is they share common procedures. There are certainly differences in a few of the actions, but one thing they all share in common is John's fancy new signs when public notice is required. Pre-application meetings are required across the board. This is a chance for the private party, the applicant, to come in, meet with the departments that are affected, and talk through whatever action they're proposing to do. These are very valuable both for the public sector and for the private party because it's an easy way to identify or unearth some high-level challenges to a given idea up front. And I've been in a number of pre-app conferences that were very helpful in changing the scope of a given project based on that feedback. Community meetings, and you guys are familiar with community meetings and what those typically entail. Obviously, they need to file an actual application. We go through a process of verifying the completeness of that application prior to actually reviewing it. In other words, we're just making sure that they have submitted everything that they need to, since they're about to spend several $1,000s on something, so that we don't miss it. And then we process the application. If needed, we're going to schedule those public hearings at the appropriate body. And then we'll deal with public notice if it's required, again, the fancy signs. And then the last stop in the common procedures is always a decision-making body of some kind. And each procedure has a different decision-making body, although you guys ultimately are the decision-making body on most of them. So in particular, dealing with rezonings, this is in Chapter 3, Section 160. We call it zoning map amendments. It literally, in the old days, it used to be where they would take that giant map they had on the wall at the permit center and they'd take it down and they would redraw some letters and some numbers on an area when it got rezoned. Now we do it all electronically. Not to continue to push the GIS department and how great they are, but one of the things that's great about our zoning map that's available online is for most of the zoning, the properties, they actually you can click through now to find the actual ordinances that resulted in the zoning that is assigned to that property. So, for example, if a property was rezoned in the late 90s or early 2000s, when you click on that individual property on the zoning map, you can see the ordinances that led to that zoning historically. It's not 100% complete yet, but it's a cool feature that we're rolling out and bringing online so that you can get that historical context of zoning. And for example, if you're scratching your head about a particular zoning in a neighborhood, you can see why it ended up that way. Zoning, this is all language from the code, but it's important language, I think, that's valuable for us to go over. As you heard Mr. Dyson and I discussing earlier, zoning is really intended to give people a sense of certainty that the land that they're purchasing or developing is going to be is going to stay that way for the long term, and it helps with neighborhood cohesion. In rezoning, we're not doing this to relieve a particular hardship. So if you bought a residential piece of property and suddenly you decided you wanted to open a head shop, like Fred alluded to, rezoning is not the tool to necessarily relieve that one hardship. It's really designed to reflect changes in public policy. The land use plan map that we just went through is a big driver of that. And so that's typically what you will see rezones done for. There are a number of rezones, though, that do come forward to you that are updates to an out-of-date zoning, or they are a zoning that was envisioned one way when it was first zoned 30 years ago. The community has changed, the historical development patterns are different, and now it's appropriate to rezone it to a new use. And it's also not used as a way to legitimize what is a non-conforming use, so you can't use it as a tool to take something that wasn't allowed and make it allowable.
Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
Thank you. This is really helpful, and so is the slide beforehand. I'm wondering if it could become a handout, a two-sided handout that applicants could take to the community meetings, because I think, well, it's all in code. Most people don't check the code. They just know that a rezone's been noticed, and they kind of start to freak out.
Sure.
And so this information, I think, would give them a place to go and look, as well as the process, because I think it gets confusing to folks.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there are handouts that exist currently that explain what zoning is or what rezoning is, but they're not nearly as well laid out as this, so I'm happy to work with the department to update those.
Thank you.
This is probably the single most important slide that I'll show you today as it relates to zoning, or rezoning, I'm sorry. And this is the approval criteria. This is in the code. This is in Title 21, Chapter 3, Section 160E. This is the criteria that we use at the staff level when we evaluate applications and offer a recommendation of approve or deny. It's the same approval criteria that the Planning and Zoning Commission uses when it evaluates its rezoning applications. And then most importantly, this is sort of the basis for your evaluation and review of rezonings when they come to you. Again, this comes straight from code, and it can be referenced anytime that you're reviewing these packets as they come across. Although typically if you have a rezoning ordinance in your packet, there is the staff packet from the original P&Z hearing attached, and you can pour through that, and staff breaks down each of these approval criteria in the staff report, and then clearly says the condition is met or not, and then a brief narrative if needed to explain how or why. Yes, John?
You know, it's not in this list, which I'm familiar with, but we have rules against spot zoning as well, so you can't.
Yeah, it's not in the
Typically
approval
less
criteria
than-
list because in the actual code section, it specifically says that spot zoning is not allowed.
And spot zoning is what?
Spot zoning is if you take an individual, it's my example I gave earlier of you take an individual parcel within an area that is largely zoned something else, and you say, even though it's R1 for the next 50 houses around me in all directions, I want this to be I1, or I want this to be commercial of some kind. Unless there's support for that kind of rezoning within either the comprehensive plan, the 2040 plan, or the neighborhood plans, that's considered spot zoning. And spot zoning is not allowable. Now, there will be instances where you will get rezoning applications, the 92nd Avenue one being a good example, where you have two uses that are abutting each other. But that was not a spot zone case because the surrounding area beyond the redeveloped property is also industrial. And so there will always be conflict at boundaries. But if that rezoning application had been for a parcel within that neighborhood, that would be considered spot zoning, and that would not have been approved.
And there's an acreage limit, like if it's over 1.75 acres, is that what?
Yeah, there's an acreage limit on the size for rezoning. It's a minimum size, not a maximum size. And we actually are debating eliminating that simply because what we're finding is there's a number of remnant parcels that are so small they can't be rezoned, and they're essentially useless at this point, but we want to see them become useful. So we're discussing that one right now.
Okay, and that's one thing I'm driving at, because we have some places here where we have recommended in the land use plan kind of higher density along transportation corridors and so on. And if you could become spot zoning with these new codes, if one property owner says, all right, I'm ready to make the switch, we can't do it because he's got to get everyone else to come along, and we're really
Well,
hamstringing.
not necessarily. So in the example that you described, if it's a transit corridor, and it's identified in the 2040 plan as being a transit corridor, and this is just the first person to come out of the gate and say, I want to take advantage of that and rezone my property. Because it's recognized in the plan, that would not be considered spot zoning.
So if you're R1, but you're looking at this brown color and saying, that says R4A, I can go my quarter acre or half acre lot and go R4A without the spot zoning. Is that
Yeah.
already allowed?
Correct. Yeah, that's allowed. And we're actually going to get to a specific case where it was on the boundary of a higher density recommendation in 2040 and was initially denied, but then they came back and revisited it and said, this boundary issue is too tough and we want to see it change.
Okay, thanks.
So I just want to note for the record that we've been joined by Mr. Constant, and then our lunch is here. So I don't know if we just want to take a couple minutes.
I'm fine.
Go
Take a
grab
break.
lunch.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's do that.
Yeah. There's a lot out there. The 92nd Avenue we want to
Yeah,
deal
that's
with.
what I was just, that kind of made me think about that.
All right, we're gonna keep going, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't go a whole lot longer. Feel free to interject questions in between bites if you still have them. I'm a visual person, as you probably have figured out. I wanted to document for you sort of the general path that a zoning map amendment takes from all the way back from initiation through all the sort of internal steps, and then where we get to sort of the external steps, and I'll go over that in a little more detail. But we've already covered the common procedures that apply to just about every entitlement process that exists. Rezones are no different. This one in particular requires a community meeting that can be challenging, and I've fielded many questions from several of you over the years about what exactly the applicant needs to be talking about at a community meeting. Rezoning requests don't always come with a project, which is a very hard community meeting to have, as we've learned and seen. But that's the truth is they're two separate actions, and they don't need to talk about necessarily what they're planning to do in the future at a community meeting for a rezoning. Now, it certainly helps. There's no denying that. And applicants that have a thorough and thought out plan and are initiating rezoning to execute that plan typically fare better. But I think it's challenging. The other challenge, to play devil's advocate, the other challenge though for the community is that I'm sure you've heard this in some of your community meetings. There is a fear and concern about speculative rezoning that exists out there. And so community members who are hearing a rezone request but don't see a project attached to that get really skeptical of that. We don't necessarily take into account speculation when we're doing our reviews. Our reviews are based on the code and the comprehensive plan. So in our view, if you are buying land in an area that the 2040 plan says will become high-density residential, and you're buying that land and you're going to rezone it, but you don't have a project yet, to us that would be fine. I don't know if I would call that speculative or not, but it conforms to the plan, and they're not required to have a project to rezone that land. So generically speaking, that would be fine. Now don't forget there's a whole list of other criteria that has to be met, but just I wanted to single that out because I've heard that that concern from community members over the past several years, and it's one that I've sort of thought about myself. But the fact of the matter is it's allowable. May not be the best investment if you're a speculator, but it's allowable. Moving on to the excitement here is once departmental review is completed and the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting has been scheduled, that's when it goes to that able body. And they have a public hearing, testimony, questions to the applicant, et cetera, et cetera. By this time, the department will have issued a case packet to Planning and Zoning, and in that case packet will be the recommendations of the department. And the department's recommendations is based
on property in the area. So the planning department does this verification since it's quick. Practice process that it's really clean.
But to more fully flesh out the answer to valid, again, these are very few and far between. But the few that I have seen, I think, try to ground it in valid concerns. And I'm going to read one. I'll read what the protest said in one of the cases we're going to cover in a little bit, so you can judge for yourself. But by and large, they do, if they're savvy enough to file a protest, they typically understand enough to formulate what we think is a valid concern, and then move forward from there.
Like for the hillside being, oh, the community meeting was inadequate or something to that effect. Okay.
Question for
Yeah, go ahead.
And this is when we act in our quasi-judicial role, or no? This is just, because I'm unclear, because we're kind of constrained by what the code says, right? Otherwise, our decision could be arbitrary and capricious, or it could be overturned. Where does this fit?
Well, it's a really interesting zoning argument. We have case law. It views very quasi-judicial, right? But we have case law from the Supreme Court that says it's camera.
Yeah, I don't have it with me, I'm sorry.
And there the court said that zonings are not quasi-judicial, they're a legislative function. So those ex parte prohibitions and communicating with the protesters, the property owner, with you, the decision makers, that doesn't apply. You can talk to them for zoning, not for some other types of appeals. So that's something to keep in mind. But you can, if you rezone to Superior Court, you go to it, say that. But it's sort of a different feel for the appellate review. They do have the arbitrary capricious because we have standards and improvement criteria. And if we just way out of that field, not following those, that's arbitrary, even though it's legislative that it can be arbitrary to use your legislative discretion to approve. So, and that's the whole top of it. So I'm not stating that entirely factually. But I think they do stand I get support from the audience.
Thanks. Go ahead, Fred.
On that subject, on a state level, the courts held that if the legislative body disobeyed their own rules, it was a de facto making a new rule, kind of a separation of powers thing. I think that was narrowly constrained, and not a general policy, but startling.
So we'd ask the Supreme Court the other states and what their rule is for rezonings, if they're constitutional or it's legislative in minority jurisdictions. So it's a minority rule the jurisdiction of other states.
That help?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Moving on to a few examples of cases that have come before the Assembly, not all of them in front of you all, but some of you may recognize a few of these. And I want to go through sort of the different types of cases, or based on the decisions that the Assembly made, the different types of cases. So the first one was a rezone in 2016. I call this one a simple approval. It was a straightforward case. This was a remnant piece of land over in the sort of industrial area, if you will, off of Sandalwood in South Anchorage, right between the highway, Lower Road, and Diamond area. All of the surrounding uses were industrial. This was a remnant piece that was not, and the property owner wished to rezone it to industrial. And the case packet was pretty straightforward. It said, yep, sure does, conforms to these policies. And keep in mind, this was before the 2040 land use plan was adopted, hence the direct reference to 2020. But it met all the standards in 160E, and so the department recommended approval. Literally, this was the meat of your ordinance. It was barely a page long, and it was very straightforward. It was dealt with in a blip, and it was approved by the body. Very simply. I'm moving on to another approval, again a straightforward approval, but this one's a little bit different, and I want to highlight it because it's actually not fairly frequent, but it's the types of rezonings that you'll see frequently in Eagle River, where there's a comprehensive plan update that may be required as well for the rezoning. This was a piece of, again, in 2016, this was a remnant piece of land at the tail end of the Aurora Village Cars complex, Minnesota Northern Lights area. I think it became a Wings Place or whatever is there now.
Panda Express.
Yeah, Panda Express. But it was actually zoned it was zoned for a residential office. So it was a weird zoning. It didn't really fit with the surrounding uses. And given the recognition of the town center for that area, we wanted to recognize that the West Anchorage District Plan, which in this case did single out a desire for residential in this area. I don't know why, but it did. That plan needed to be updated because this was changing that recommendation of the West Anchorage District Plan. So because it required a comp plan amendment, and was a rezone, they moved forward in tandem. So there were two ordinances that the Assembly dealt with. The first was the rezone, and the second was the first was the comp plan update. The second was the rezone. And so those are more rare. You won't see those very often. We do see them from time to time in Eagle River, but they're relatively rare. So I only highlight that because sometimes you'll get two items on your agenda and you'll think that they're related and you're wondering why they're there. They might be related. It might be a comp plan amendment and a rezone approval. So moving on to the fun stuff, this is one where the body made the decision to remand. So this was a rezone request in 2016 again. This is one that Assemblymember Constance is very familiar with. This was a R2 piece of land that they wanted to upzone to R4. It was on one side of the street were single family and duplex houses, but on the other side of the street there were high density multifamily developments. This particular applicant wanted to do a lower intensity multifamily development that was greater than a duplex, and decided that they'd like to rezone. Now, this one had all the bells and whistles. This had a protest filed when it came to the Assembly, which created the supermajority, and ultimately led to the decision to remand. I'll add that now. And then also had a lot of public testimony. It was a very sort of contentious rezone. And at the end of the day, I think the Assembly felt that they actually, I think, thought it was not a terrible idea. But given the public opposition and because a valid protest had been filed and it required 8 Assembly members to approve, the wiser decision was to remand it back to planning and zoning so that at planning and zoning, which is the more appropriate venue, the applicant in the neighborhood could work through the challenges or the issues that had brought them all out. Ultimately, that's what happened, and it came back to the body and was approved. But in this case, the assembly recognized that there still was a lot more ground to cover, and so it was remanded back to P&Z. So that was interesting. That one was the unit lot subdivision development off of 11th and Cordova. That was highly contentious.
Yeah, thank you. So for the remand action by the assembly, are we limited in the reason for remand that we can send it back? Because this seemed like, oh, go back and like try to work it out. And it almost seems like, so my mind's thinking much like a court would remand something. It's usually to do something, to apply a particular standard or develop facts or something. So I don't know if we're stuck with a standard when we say you remand, like you have to go do a particular thing.
If you'd like, I can read to you from the code citation where remanding is covered, and if that answers your question.
I can just jot it down and look it up myself.
Well, it is in code. So 2103 160, the section that deals with rezonings, does cover the decision to remand. Although Dean looks like he would like to add something to it.
I have the code in front of me here in 2116. So that's the A, it's probably simply option, and this the ECD, who's remand. It doesn't say, it says remand proposed amendment to the Planning and Zoning Commission, which will comment to you of the assembly to do that as well for further consideration. But of course, you want to make some reasons, statement about why you're sending it for remand, and why you were able to come to an approved decision. Some more information about the approved part of the decision whether you can choose now. Have some reasons for remand, and that's one of those. So I think that's.
And in this particular, in this particular case, that did occur, probably at Dean's recommending. The assembly or an assembly member at the time drafted an AIM for the body, and in that AIM it provided instructions, if you will, to planning and zoning that outlined what they heard as the most contentious issues related to parking, etc. And essentially said, planning and zoning, this is what we heard, and these are the things we want you to consider when this comes back to you.
Makes a lot more sense.
But it's not in code. It was good practice at the time.
Okay. Thank you. Very helpful.
Can I just make a comment?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to encourage us not to do that unless there's an absolutely good reason, because I think that these processes take so long as it is that I think sometimes our political will, if we're not, we have to make tough decisions, and sometimes it might be easier to remand so we don't have to. I'm not suggesting anybody individually is doing that, but so we don't have to make a hard decision, but I think it just means that people are going to be less likely to do developments and build homes and all of those things that come with it.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask, sure, go ahead, Chris, and then I'll ask my question.
Just on the counter to that, though, I think that in this specific case and in a number of other cases, the process to remand actually allowed for a more thorough investigation that provided the membership confidence to approve where they were concerned before where they couldn't. And so the 2 or 3 times I've seen it, it's proven to be very effective at filling in the gaps of information that were not otherwise presented.
Yeah, if it's needed, of course, that makes sense. I just want to make a comment about us not using that as a crutch to try to not make difficult decisions that our constituents don't like.
Yeah, it worked out well in this case, as Assemblymember Constant pointed out, and then as I alluded to when I started, the member that pushed this actually did the math and recognized the body wasn't going to pass it. So, like I said, it was a good idea, and it just needed a little bit more time in the oven. To Assemblymember Zalatel's question about valid protest, this was the one I wanted to read the protest language to you. I didn't include it as a slide. But it was very well thought out, and they strongly opposed the rezone because the rezone is in conflict with the draft land use plan map. This group was savvy enough to know that the land use plan update was coming and recognized that this one was actually on the boundary between low intensity and high intensity. That there was round opposition from the South Addition Community Council, including a resolution. and that the rezone is in conflict with the general principles of the South Addition neighborhood land use. And this, that's a fancy way of saying they actually read the comp plan and recognized that we acknowledge in the comp plan that South Addition is a lower intensity residential district.
Well, that seems like a really good reason for
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah, and like I said, the AIM that Assemblymember Flynn drafted really honed in on what they heard at public testimony, which was parking, and too tall or too intense. And so when it came back forward, it was I think a much better product.
Thank you. Dean, did you have something to add?
I wanted to sort of supplement what I said earlier about the exporting rule. It doesn't apply, or you could say women's only, because what I need to emphasize that when there's an appeal to Superior Court, the rules change. It's in litigation number, so they got to be Supreme Court. They shouldn't be talking to the parties then. The parties to be huge for things on the speech. So I just want to make sure that
Okay.
Should we let them know that there currently is a matter in that posture?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Please this Police versus Municipality of Anchorage, it's about Bruce and Clark subdivision.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yes.
Ferguson Jones,
Yeah.
right?
The Canyon Road case.
Okay.
Okay.
So that one is on appeal. The clerk's office has provided the record to the Superior Court, and Quincy Arms is the attorney representing the Assembly. We briefed Mr. Rivera, and for your information, the judge in the case is, I believe it's pronounced Danielle Bailey. Is that correct?
No, she's on P&Z.
She's P&Z.
She's not a judge.
She should be a judge.
She's not a judge.
There'll be a little bit of a conflict.
Oh, okay, so I must be, I thought it was, yeah, we'll send you an email to let you know who the judge is, just in case you run across a judge, and the names of all of the appellants.
Great. And so not that it would happen, but if it does happen, if someone reaches out to us, our duty is to refer them to our attorney.
Yes, and
Okay. Great.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about one type of case that you guys just saw on Tuesday night, actually. And this was, even though it was called a rezone, really what you were being asked to do was to modify the special limitations that existed on a current zoning. This was for the Debenham multifamily complex off of Raspberry. And in that one, all that the body was doing really was changing one line to clarify the height limitation on this multifamily development. So that was one case where, even though it was a rezone, there wasn't like a big rezone or big change in the underlying zoning.
Felix.
Yeah, go ahead,
I
Chris.
would just offer that case was very interesting because most of the rezones we see that deal with height in neighborhoods, we see warfare break out, people in corners shouting at each other. This one was, Austin and I were talking about, it's baffling how uncontroversial it was.
Well, I alluded to it earlier. This property has a very long and convoluted history, and you're getting it in the honeymoon stage. To get to where it was now, in fact, it happened when you were on the commission, John. The initial rezone that led to these special limitations, where there was a lot of public opposition, and ultimately, I think the commission did the right thing. And the applicant came back and many years later and asked for a slight tweak, and it's all going to work out. But the particular property has been through the entitlement process a number of times over the past 20 years, and it took a while to get to where it is, but it's finally moving forward. So, and then the last type of case I actually didn't put on the screen for some reason, but I'll have to describe it to you. Is the case where the body chooses to deny, and in this case. This was not a straight up or down vote. This was instead a move to postpone indefinitely, which, as you all know, is effectively killing something. So this was the case that Dean just warned us about. One of the first times it came to the body, during that time, the body chose to postpone indefinitely rather than outright deny it. And so effectively that killed it, and that applicant had to redo and come back to the assembly with a different rezone request later, which in and of itself was a fairly contentious issue. But in my time here, I don't think I've ever seen you guys deny a rezone. That was the only one, was the indefinite postponement that happened shortly after we started. But typically, you guys, I think, get through it pretty well. So.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to add that postponing indefinitely is an unusual motion in Robert's rules, although in our world we do say that it kills things. Technically it doesn't, and I believe that there was a rezone at one time that was brought back in front of the table because all you did was postpone it indefinitely. Voting it down is really how you kill something. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but Jennifer Johnston was on the body, and she's the one that brought it back. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And it not only did she bring it back, but then there was another vote to postpone indefinitely, and then a motion to reconsider that vote, which died also. It was very complicated.
So we're not encouraging them to postpone it
we wouldn't.
In general.
Right.
So,
on rezones.
Okay.
On rezones, because I'm not sure if Chris said this or not, but it results in not final action for you.
I was just wondering why not for other things too, but anyway, sorry.
It's
You're
true
reading.
for not other things, but I don't think that's going to
It's
happen.
not as big of a problem.
Yeah.
So what would your motion be in this case? Do you move to approve and then it gets voted down? Or
Correct.
do you move to deny? That's sort of a negative, but that is our action. Our action is to deny.
Actually, I'll defer to the clerk on that one.
Your motion always needs to be in the positive. You can't have a motion to deny. So it's a motion to approve and you recommend a no vote.
There you go. Yeah. And that's it. That's in summary. Oh, sorry.
To follow up on that, Barbara, so it's better if we were to get to final action because the administrative, I'm sure that the appeal timeline doesn't start to tick till we do something definitive to close it out, or does the motion to postpone indefinitely get them going on their ability to, because it doesn't seem like action. It doesn't seem like action on the application. It's just that we're never going to take it up. Well, the intent is not to take it back out for a long, long time.
I don't know the answer to that. I think you would have to ask Dean that question.
Just thinking off the top of my head, I think that, you might have someone saying something to you just because there was a final action. It would be much better for the property owners and fair for them, for the property owner, the developer, and the neighbors, if you make sure it's a final action form with a motion to approve and it's voted down or it's voted out rather than postpone indefinitely. It adds some cloud of uncertainty or that's appealing.
And let me add to that as well that in the code doesn't deal specifically with how you deny. It just all of the timelines in code separate from the appeal process, but within Title 21, there's prohibitions against an applicant coming back to you with the same rezone request for 2 years following denial. So if it's not fully denied, we don't really know how to deal with that.
Thank you. Helpful.
Yeah. Was that it? That was it. Yeah, no, I wanted to end early. I know you've got a big court work session coming up. So if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Thanks so much, Chris.
You bet.
All right. So we're upstairs for the next one in 15 minutes.